Hi friends, welcome to the Econista. I'm so glad you're here. I originally had a different video planned to shoot today, but we just had a really big update on housing policy in the US. I'm shooting this on July 12th. It'll come out in a few weeks, but actually as of yesterday, we had the 21st Century Road to Housing Act actually become law. And so I wanted to do a whole video covering that, what it is, how much of an impact I think it will actually have on housing. And so I'm going to go through a few of the key themes and the problems that this act tries to solve. And first I'm going to lay out exactly how we got here because it's been kind of a wild ride. The 21st Century Road to Housing Act actually passed both houses of Congress in a landslide. In the House, the vote was 358 to 32, and in the Senate, it was passed 85 to 5. I honestly didn't even know that these legislatures could pass something with those kind of margins in 2026. So I was flabbergasted to see that this passed by a landslide. The initial plan was to have this big signing ceremony. President Trump would come. It would be this big thing because housing is obviously a core issue. It's a big part of the affordability crisis. And so that was the original plan. And on the day that they were supposed to have the ceremony, Congress people are talking all about it. And then Trump makes a post on Truth Social and says, nope, not going to happen. I'm going to cancel the whole thing and I will not sign this bill unless Congress passes the SAVE Act, which is a completely different piece of legislation about voter ID requirements. Unfortunately for him, they had veto-proof margins. And essentially what happened is we ended up in a waiting game where I think it was 10 business days had to pass. And on midnight, July 10th, the act became a law without President Trump's signature. So it's a really interesting situation that we find ourselves in where it's something that I think politically should have been a slam dunk, but for whatever reason, he decided not to sign. And it doesn't really matter because they actually had enough bipartisan support that this is going to become a law. Very exciting. The New York Times called it the most significant piece of housing legislation passed since the 1990s, which once we go through this, we'll both explain how that is a compliment because we have done so little on housing policy, and also a critique because this is not a huge set of changes. I'll walk you through exactly what it does, but I would call this a marginal gain for us, not necessarily a huge change in the way housing policy is going to be handled in the US. There are a lot of provisions in this act, so I'm going to break it down into 4 categories of provisions, tell you some of the provisions that are in that category and how useful I think this will be in tackling the housing affordability challenges in the US. The first category I would call capital and investment. This really focuses on freeing up capital for investment in homes and then also making it easier for buyers to get a loan for their home. The first piece of this is that they increase the cap on banks putting their capital towards affordable housing projects. So previously this was at 15% and they increased it to 20%. So that is a meaningful change, but not huge. The next few items in this category are all about adjustments to FHA loans. FHA loans are Federal Housing Authority loans, and they are really focused on making it easier for first-time home buyers or low-income buyers to get loans. They're backed by the federal government, and they also have a lower threshold of down payments. The first modification to FHA loans is they increase the limit for multi-family housing projects. So this should increase the potential for buyers to get a loan on multi-family buildings. In addition to increasing the limit, they actually tied it to automatic adjustments, which I think is actually a bigger move because Congress doesn't pass a lot of housing legislation. So that will allow the limit to really keep up with inflation going forward. Another piece of this is that they are starting a pilot program for FHA loans for small dollar mortgages. So these are mortgages under $100,000. A lot of time buyers have trouble getting small dollar loans because banks just don't make that much money on these loans. And so this pilot program will be focused on providing loans under $100,000 to individuals. So I think that could be a real win if you live in a more rural area. Unfortunately, I think it's probably fewer and fewer homes that you can purchase for $100,000. But for individuals in that situation, I think this could be a real win. The last update to FHA loans is increasing the limits that can be taken out for manufactured homes or mobile homes. These tend to be the least costly homes that someone can purchase. So by increasing the limits here, that probably is going to help people get into manufactured homes. And that's definitely a win. These are all good things, the updates in this category. However, I don't anticipate this is going to have a huge impact. Really, the focus here is on getting more capital out the door and making it easier for people to get loans. The problem with that is that it really doesn't do anything to address housing affordability. It's sort of similar to higher education, where just because you can get a loan for something that's super expensive doesn't mean you can actually afford the loan. And as I mentioned in my last video, an increasing percentage of both renters and homeowners are cost burdened, spending 30% or more of their income on housing each month. And so giving people access to more loans, I don't think necessarily solves it, but there may be some people who, for example, on the small dollar loans, wouldn't have access to a loan before and now can purchase a property. So I think it is meaningful in the situations in which it applies. But again, this really doesn't solve the affordability piece. The next category of changes in the Act is really all about reducing the cost to build by removing regulatory requirements. So there's a couple pretty interesting pieces of legislation that all kind of tackle this overall theme. The first is around how many staircases a building has to have, which I had to research this because I didn't know anything about it, but here's how it breaks down. So in the US, typically above 3 or 4 stories, you are required to have 2 staircases in a building. Obviously, the more staircases you put in, the less leasable square footage you have on each of your floors. In Europe and parts of Asia, it's really common for you to be able to have only 1 staircase in a building up to 6 floors or potentially even more. So this change is going to change the guidelines from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So it is basically recommending only requiring 1 staircase up to 6 floors. That will increase the leasable units in a given apartment building. The thing is, it doesn't require localities to adopt this, so they can decide if they will or if they won't. If they do adopt this, I do think this can help lower the cost of building projects and provide additional units where it is adopted. Another regulatory change in the bill is actually a change to the requirements for manufactured homes or mobile homes. So previously, manufactured homes were required to have a chassis attached so they could be moved from place to place, what puts the mobile in mobile home. But fewer than 10% of people actually move a manufactured home once it is delivered to their property. So this is just adding additional cost without actually increasing the functionality. And it also makes it difficult if someone would want to stack these, makes it a little bit less flexible. Removing this requirement could save up to $10,000 on the cost to producing a manufactured home. Considering these are the least costly housing available today, I think this actually could have a real impact. And given that so few people are actually moving their homes, I don't see a lot of downside here. I think this is just a big win. And on the lower end of the market, I think that's even better. So I am definitely a fan of that provision. Another provision in this category is reducing the requirements for environmental review under NEPA, or the National Environmental Protection Act. In my last video, I talked a lot about NIMBYism and basically homeowners trying to fight from having additional housing, particularly apartment buildings or multifamily units built near their houses. This is one way they do it, is by using the environmental review to basically add costs to the builders and dissuade them from building new properties. So this change actually would eliminate the requirement for an environmental review for any infill housing. Basically any housing built in already developed residential area, so not housing that would go into new areas of a city, but anything within the existing buildings in a city. I think this is a big win. This eliminates one of the levers that NIMBYs have to pull to prevent new building and should reduce the costs. In my last video, I talked about how the costs of regulatory requirements really add to the overall cost of building. So I think this is a pretty significant win. And the last two pieces of this are new programs that are launching. One is a program to review small designs at a federal level and basically pre-approve them. This should help with local permitting and really speed things up. The other is a new program all about converting office space to residential housing. This is a big focus after the COVID-19 pandemic when we still have a lot of offices that are sitting empty, and so I think that's a win to be able to convert them into housing units. Overall, this group of changes is the one I'm most excited about. In my last video, I talked a lot about how a big problem in US housing is just the lack of supply. The changes in this category should help to increase supply by reducing the costs of building new housing and reducing some of the administrative overhead. So I am definitely most excited about this category. Do I think this is going to make a huge difference? Probably not. I think this is going to be some modest improvements, but I think this category is the category that's most likely to help with the supply side, and that's where I feel like a big part of the problem is. So this is definitely what I think will be the most impactful improvements in the bill. The next category of changes in the Act is really all around incentivizing local zoning reforms. The core piece of this is what's called the Build Now Act. And the way this works is basically by tying existing grants through the Community Development Block Grant Program to how much housing a community is actually building. So these grants are given to cities and counties to help them with infrastructure development, building low-income housing, services for low-income residents. It's a really great program. And ultimately what it's trying to do is incentivize building more housing, because communities that build more housing can get up to a 10% increase on their grants, and communities that fall behind in building housing can lose up to 10% of their grants. Another piece of this category of reforms is that HUD is going to work on developing best practice frameworks and offering advisory supports to local communities. None of this is going to be mandatory, but it is an additional resource for communities who are looking for that guidance. Overall, I don't think this program is going to have a big impact, especially on larger cities, which oftentimes are more resistant to building housing. I'll use San Francisco as an example. San Francisco receives a little bit under $19 million in the community development block grants each year. So worst case, if they don't build enough housing, which they probably will not, they'll lose 10% of that, so less than $2 million. The annual budget of San Francisco is $16 billion. So as much as I would like to believe that losing $2 million would change their desire to build housing, I just don't think it's going to happen. I think a lot of large cities, because they have a large overall budget, are going to be able to absorb a 10% decrease in these grants. Obviously, it's not ideal to lose money. I think smaller cities or cities that have tighter budgets, this might be meaningful, but honestly, I would have liked to see a lot more than 10%. I think something like 30, 40, 50% could be more meaningful. This is not that big of a change. I'm all about incentives. I think incentives are really powerful. I just don't think this is a very strong incentive. Again, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I think especially for large cities, they're probably not gonna do much to sway whether they're gonna be on losing 10% or gaining 10%. The last category of changes in this act is probably the one you've heard covered in the news, and that is the ban on institutional investors purchasing homes. So it is a ban on any institutional investor that owns more than 350 homes. They are not allowed to purchase any more homes for immediate sale. Now, they don't have to divest in the homes they already own, so it's not going to roll back the clock on what they've already purchased, but it is a ban going forward. There is an exception in the bill for build-to-rent properties and developments there. Build-to-rent properties are basically when an investment institution is building new homes not with the aim of selling them, but in order to rent them out to individuals. The exception here is that they are allowed to invest in build to rent, but they have to sell those homes within 7 years. Honestly, that's not very attractive to these investment companies. 7 years isn't a lot of time to make back what you've invested in these houses, and it just means you're gonna constantly have to be investing in new housing. So a lot of companies have been really vocal about the fact that they are going to pull back from projects that are build to rent given this new provision. I personally think that could be a problem. So the thing is, build to rent is actually solving a need for a lot of families. It gives families who maybe can't afford to buy in an area the opportunity to rent a full house. It also gives you an opportunity if maybe you've just moved to town and you don't know if you want to buy a house, but you don't necessarily want to move into an apartment or a multifamily unit. I think there are some use cases where these properties are actually valuable. They also tend to be rented out to lower income individuals who maybe can't afford the price to purchase. Ultimately, I don't think there's a lot in this bill that actually addresses the largest problems that we have, but I do think these are going to moderately help the situation that we have. So I think this bill is okay. I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. My concern is more so that Congress hasn't passed anything on housing since the 1990s, and if this is the only bill we get, I don't think this is going to be enough. I think there's also two significant concerns I have with the act that I don't see getting a lot of coverage in the media. The first is that this act doesn't actually approve a single dollar of federal money to be spent. So this is actually called out, but this bill authorizes a lot of these programs. It doesn't actually appropriate money towards them. So Congress has to go back and later approve the spending to actually implement a lot of these programs. Nothing has actually been done as part of the act. So while these programs might sound great on paper, they don't actually have the federal funding behind them yet. The second significant concern is I mentioned a few times that programs will be done by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD. As part of not actually appropriating any funds, there is no increased funding for HUD in this act. And unfortunately, a lot of the staff in HUD has been cut recently as part of DOGE and other programs that the current administration has run. So HUD is currently underfunded and understaffed, and there are 35 programs that it is supposed to implement based on this act. So I am a bit concerned about the department actually having the capacity needed to make the things in this act a reality. Overall, I think this act is what Congress could do without worrying about upsetting homeowners. And as I mentioned in the previous video, I think homeowners not wanting to see the price of their houses either stay stagnant or decrease is a big problem, and that really does force legislators to tinker around the edges rather than making some significant changes that will bring the cost of housing down. Because when a lot of Americans have housing as their number one investment, and even if they're not going to see the dollars of an increase in the price of their house, they like to feel good when looking at that price going up and up. You are sort of locked into this system where a lot of the constituents in your country want the price of housing to just keep going up. And so the folks that aren't in the housing market are just going to continue to be left behind as long as government regulators decide to make their decisions based on the homeowners and the power of their vote. I think we're going to kind of stay in a similar situation where, yes, maybe we are making marginal improvements, but we're not really tackling this problem head on. So that's my take. Feel free to leave in the comments if you have other views on this, but looking at the actual meat of the bill, that's where I land. So now that we have gone through housing, why the cost of housing is so high, and what new changes we're expecting to see with the 21st Century Road to Housing Act now as law, my next video is going to be all about healthcare. Why is healthcare so expensive in the US compared to other countries? And why are we getting worse outcomes while spending more? I'll tackle all of that in my next video. I'm Teresa, and I studied economics so you don't have to.